I stepped out of the yellow cab in Richmond, Virginia, my duffel bag heavy at my side and my uniform crisp. I'm Emily Hayes, 47, just discharged after 25 years in the Army. The air smelled of damp grass and old brick. My heart pounded. I paused behind the iron gate of my childhood home. A camera whirred above me. I lifted my hand to press the buzzer. No click of a lock. Only a buzz, then silence. I tried again. "Sarah, it's me!" My voice cracked. The gate clicked open before I saw her. My sister Sarah Hayes, a 44-years-old tailored blazer phone pressed to her ear blocked the path. "I'm calling the police," she said, eyes cold. "Someone's trespassing. Claims to be family." "Sarah, this is our parents' house," I said, voice low. I tightened my grip on the bag. She rolled her eyes. "You disappeared 25 years ago. You're off the deed. Off the will. You have no rights here." I swallowed. I just wanted to come home. The words felt hollow. In the distance, red and blue lights appeared. 2 officers stepped out of a cruiser. One young one seasoned. The older one raised an eyebrow at me. "Lieutenant Colonel Hayes," he asked. "Pentagon certified." I nodded. "This is my family home." Sarah crossed her arms. "Not anymore," she said. "It belongs to Sarah and her husband, Kyle Turner. No record shows you own it." The officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, unless you have proof, we'll need you to leave." I looked down the street and back at the gate. My medals ached at my chest. I fumbled for my discharge papers, but I knew they wouldn't matter. I backed up onto the sidewalk. The police lights glowed off the wrought iron. I heard my phone buzz. A text from Mom. "Don't come back. You have nothing here." I let the phone slip from my fingers. Through the window behind Sarah, I saw my father's silhouette. He didn't look at me. He didn't move. That night, I slept in my rented sedan, staring at the dark outline of the home I'd loved. Before dawn, a for sale sign appeared on the lawn. By 9, I shuffled into a corner cafe, Lisa Chen, 42. My college roommate, and now a real estate paralegal, greeted me with concern in her eyes. She tapped her tablet. There it was, my old house, listed under Redwood Holdings, LLC. "And look," she said, sliding over a property transfer document. My name was on the seller line, but that signature was a fake. Lisa's finger hovered over a notary stamp flagged for forgery last year. I closed my eyes and let out a shaky breath. They'd stolen more than my home. They'd stolen my history. I met Lisa's gaze. "What do we do now?" I whispered. Walked down the marble corridor of Richmond City Hall, the early light filtering through tall windows and catching motes of dust like tiny stars. The walls were lined with polished wood and framed proclamation citations for community heroes. A faded American flag in the corner, its stripes drooping in mid-morning stillness, as if weary from carrying so many civic promises. I pressed my fingertips against the cool brass door of the records vault, feeling the weight of every step I'd taken since stepping out of that taxi. My civilian clothes felt strange over the uniform I carried in my bones. Faded jeans, a loose gray sweater, my hair pulled back in a low ponytail rather than the crisp knot I wore on duty. When I'd rung Sarah's bell, I imagined this doorway would swing open to welcome me. Instead, the gate clicked shut. The police arrived, and the house I loved turned into a fortress where I was the enemy. So here I was, chasing legal paperwork in a building that still believed in red tape and sworn oaths. Lisa Chen. My college roommate, someone who knew me before I ever earned a rank, stood by my side, her tablet glowing with lines of case law. Her eyes were steady. "They can't hide it in here," she whispered, running her finger over file codes. I nodded, but my gut churned. The smell of ink and paper made me think of medals boxed away in my attic proof of service, mothballed with old tax returns. I felt my knuckles turn white around the duffel strap dangling at my feet. Pulling that bag here had felt like carrying my entire identity into a stranger's courtroom. I closed my eyes for a moment, inhaled the smell of history and bureaucracy, then exhaled. "Let's find the deed," I said. The registrar's assistant led us to a row of metal cabinets, each drawer labeled with years and lot numbers. I crouched and slid open one. My heart thudded when I saw the name Redwood Holdings, followed by Grantor Hayes Family Trust. I rifled through papers until a brittle sheet slid into my palm. My father's signature curled at the bottom in ink unnecessarily bold for the wrist it came from. I stared until the letters blurred red. "This can't be real," I murmured. Lisa's hand found mine. Before I could ask a single question, a shadow passed across the narrow window, and the lock clicked as cold footsteps halted just beyond the vault door. I could feel the tremor in my fingertips as I crouched beside the locked vault door, my breath settling into a steady rhythm I learned in basic training. I pressed my ear against the cold metal and heard muffled voices, one calm measured the other urgent. I exchanged a look with Lisa. She flipped open her tablet and tapped at the emergency override code we'd lifted from a subpoena loophole. The screen glowed like a flashlight in the dark. "It should buzz," she muttered. Instead, we heard a key turn on the other side. Panic crawled up my spine. I pictured Sarah's husband, Mark Turner, the corporate shark I once trusted enough to shake hands with, slipping behind that door to catch us red-handed. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stand. "On 3, I said. I bent to wedge a pen into the latch, hoping to buy time. Lisa jiggled the tablet again. I heard steel grinding. The voices stopped. Footsteps. Then the click of a lock engaging. "Damn it," Lisa whispered. The door sealed us inside the vault. Row after row of metal cabinets stood like sentinels. My eyes flicked to file drawer 17B, the one we'd targeted. I lunged for it, yanked it open, and papers cascaded to the floor, property deeds, bank statements, forged affidavits. My heart pounded so loudly, I thought it would lift me off the ground. I scooped up the documents, scanning for the notarized copy of the will. My fingers trembled when I found it Grandpa's signature, crisp and original. I shoved it into my duffel, where the hum of the city outside was muffled behind steel walls. "Got it," I said, voice tight. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I fished it out without looking. The screen displayed a private number and a message, "Destroy those files. Now." My blood went cold. Adrenaline surging, I shoved my duffel toward Lisa. We had 20 seconds before whoever lurked outside decided to breach these walls. Lisa swiped across her tablet, fingers flying as she rewrote the override protocol. The vault door shuddered with a metallic groan, then clunked open. We stumbled into the hallway, clutching our prize, an original will, and the incriminating affidavit. My pulse pounded in my ears as we darted past filing cabinets and law books, the soft hum of air conditioning our only soundtrack. Suddenly, a voice called from behind a security desk. "You Hayes, you look familiar." I froze. Mr. Delgado, the records assistant who'd stamped those files, rose from his stool. He slid a small USB drive across the desk. "Take this," he whispered. "It's logs of email traffic. Redwood funded the anti-veteran bill last year. They've been buying influence." I hesitated, trusting someone in the belly of this machine felt like stepping off a cliff. But hope flared in my chest. I grabbed the drive and slid it into my pocket. "How do we get out?" Lisa asked, eyes wide. He pointed to a service corridor door marked "Exit Only." "They won't lock you out there. Go fast." As we slipped down the dim passage, my mind raced with every social conflict these papers exposed, corporate interests pitted against living veterans. A sister torn between family and profit. A city swallowing its own history for tax breaks. At the end of the corridor, the exit door yawned open. We spilled onto the sidewalk, the afternoon sun scorching our skin. I clutched the duffel like a lifeline, thinking of Grandpa's oak furniture in that house, solid, unwavering. This was our proof. Then my phone vibrated, a new message from that same private number. "You've stirred the hornet's nest. Lieutenant Hayes, he's here to see you." The hot August sun beat against the windshield as I drove us away from City Hall duffel. On the back seat, my gaze fixed on the rearview mirror. Every mile felt heavy, like dragging a wounded soldier across no man's land. Lisa sat beside me, with her laptop open, fingers poised above the keys. We pulled into the parking lot of her grandfather's vacant office, a shabby brick building 2 blocks from the James River. Red graffiti marred the door, and the windows were papered over, but to me it looked like Fort Knox. Inside, fluorescent bulbs buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow on dusty desks. I dropped the duffel and sat heavy on a swivel chair, heart still hammering. "I can't believe Sarah did this," I muttered, unzipping the bag. The will lay on top, Grandpa's handwriting, as clear as memory. Beneath it, stacks of forged deeds and bank records, each sheet inscribed with my name, my lineage, my life. Lisa slid out the USB Delgado had given us and plugged it into her laptop. Rows of CSV files loaded. Here, she said, pulling up an email chain titled Project Endgame. Sarah's address sat at the top, followed by Mark Turner's signature, pushed the legislation. No mercy. My chest tightened. I stared at the screen until the glow blurred. Beside the thread, another attachment, a memo asserting Redwood's need to reassign veteran tax credits to corporate boosters. My blood ran cold as I read line after line of numbers, lobbyist contacts, hell-bent rationalizations that valor was expendable. The smell of stale coffee drifted from an old mug. I noticed a brown ring on the desk, its circular stain like a broken chain demanding freedom. A sob rose in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I had to be the anchor now, the one who held fast. I reached across and grabbed Lisa's hand. "We have them," I whispered, voice firm. Lisa nodded, eyes ringed with fatigue and steel. We exchanged a look that said this fight had only begun. Then, without warning, the fluorescent lights above us flickered and snapped off, plunging the room into darkness. The sudden blackout threw me off balance, knocking the laptop screen to a slanted angle, its glow like a dying ember. Then a pinprick of light blinked in the corner, a lantern swinging from a rusted beam, where a motion sensor still worked. I exhaled and stood flicking my phone's flashlight on. Lisa cursed under her breath, but lifted the laptop with practiced calm. "We need a public network," she said, voice low. "This place is compromised." I nodded and raced out into the hallway, duffel slung over one shoulder light from my phone bouncing against peeling paint. The night air hit me like a wave, cool and humid. I jumped into my car and pulled back onto the main road, tires hissing on asphalt. 15 minutes later, we rolled up to the Rising Phoenix, a dimly lit bar where the neon logo flared like hope in the gloom. Inside, smoke curled around low-hanging lamps, and the clink of glasses felt like old war drums. The place was half empty, a handful of veterans nursing cold beers, and memories they'd never share out loud. I spotted Reggie Kelly behind the bar, broad shoulders, salt and pepper crew-cut eyes that had tracked missiles and secrets. He nodded when I entered, sliding a bourbon across to me before I asked. "I heard you needed safe haven," he said gruffly. I slid the duffel onto the stool beside me and unzipped it, revealing the original will and the laptop. Reggie's lips pressed into a thin line. "They'll go after your head," he warned. "Not just your title, but your mind. They'll say you're unstable, Vietnam flashbacks, PTSD, whatever sticks." I clenched my jaw. "Let them spin," I replied quietly. I'd rather be called crazy for chasing justice than complicit in their crimes. He poured another drink and slid a folded note across. I opened it. "Meet me tomorrow at sunrise." No cameras, no signature. My heart jerked into my throat. Around me, the other patrons sat in shadow, watching, listening. I realized I was surrounded by faces shaped by war, all of us carrying stories no one would believe until we proved them in court. I took a slow sip, feeling the burn in my chest, and rose. "Let them watch," I said, voice steady. "I'll be ready." The sky was still that pale slate of early dawn as I backed my car onto the gravel lot behind an abandoned tobacco warehouse by the James River. The air smelled of wet wood and rust, and the only light came from a single orange bulb swaying above a battered loading dock. I stepped out, duffel in hand. Uniform jacket tossed across my arm like a second skin I refused to shed. Lisa's text buzzed. "I'm outside." I turned at the echo of her footsteps. She arrived in her old Toyota hood, rattling like a dying machine. We carried the original will and USB drive between us, our breath forming clouds in the chill morning air. In the shadows, a lone figure emerged. A man in a gray hoodie, hands shoved into pockets. Michael Mick Turner, a former Navy corpsman turned private investigator. He nodded once, his face shadowed, but eyes bright with purpose. He led us inside the warehouse past stacks of wooden crates stamped with government seals, their contents long since pillaged. We stopped before a steel box bolted to the wall, a server vault. Mick crouched and tapped a sequence on his phone. The bolts clicked, and the front panel swung open. Rows of hard drives and Ethernet cables coiled like steel snakes. He pulled out a silver canister, dusted off a single leaf, curled brown unmistakably from the sycamore in Grandpa's yard. "They taped this to the drives," he said quietly. Symbolic threat or warning? I'm not sure. I held the leaf in my palm, feeling the ridges of its veins. It was a message. They knew where I came from, and they dimmed those roots. Mick plugged in the USB, copying terabytes of email logs, bank audits, chain of custody files, proof of Redwood's entire con. "This is it," Lisa said, voice shaking. "With this, we bring them down." My heart pounded as I zipped the canister into my duffel. I thought of the sycamore tree's branches scraping the attic window of childhood's scraped knees and laughter under its shade. I thought of Sarah's betrayal and our parents' silence. I felt a fierce heat burn inside me. "Let's finish this," I said. In that dusty warehouse with the first fingers of sunlight grazing the river outside, I stepped further into the storm, knowing there was no turning back. I arrived at the U.S. Attorney's office just as the first yellow rays of dawn split the horizon. The city quiet, except for the hum of traffic beginning to stir on Broad Street. I straightened my blazer, still stiff from overnight anxieties, and felt the weight of every step I'd taken since reopening this fight. The polished floors reflected my tense reflection, a soldier-turned whistleblower dragging family bones into public view. I could smell coffee from the lobby kiosk and remembered how sleep had abandoned me weeks ago, traded for case files and adrenaline. Each lobby chair felt like a cold reminder of how far from home I'd come, and yet nothing had felt more like purpose. Walking toward AUSA, Diane Martinez's office, I replayed Grandpa's voice in my head. Justice isn't won in silence, and urged my racing heart to steady. In that moment, the polished brass nameplate on her door looked like an altar I'd been avoiding my whole life, and I realized I'd willingly step into any storm if it meant exposing the truth we'd buried beneath forged deeds and broken oaths. Inside her office was lined with law books and framed commendations, a stark counterpoint to the gamble we were about to take. Diane Martinez, 45, sharp-eyed tenure at DOJ, rose from behind her mahogany desk and offered a firm handshake. She'd already reviewed the original will and bank records we'd supplied, but her expression told me we needed more internal communications, tying Sarah and Mark directly to Redwood's anti-veteran lobbying. "These documents are rock solid," she said. Voice low, but Redwood's reach runs deep. "Their legal team will fight tooth and nail, and will need incontrovertible proof of conspiracy from inside their own servers." My chest tightened at the thought of another clandestine operation, but I nodded. We had Mick Turner's field intel, Lisa Chen's digital forensics, and now the Department of Justice's backing. Martinez slid a calendar across her desk, a preliminary hearing in 10 days. She warned me the press would swarm. I swallowed, remembering how cameras had once cheered my return as a hero. Now they would cast me as a renegade. We finalized our plan, gain access to Redwood's internal email archives, copy the Project Phoenix folder, and unmask the corporate engine behind every stolen credit. Every syllable she spoke felt like a countdown, and I knew the next move would decide whether I broke them or broke myself. Back in my apartment, I found a plain brown envelope resting against the doorframe, inches from my boot, for maximum theatricality. I bent to pick it up. Inside lay a single dried sycamore leaf, its veins jagged and brittle as a broken promise, and a slip of white paper stamped with a typewriter font. "Next time, Emily, it'll be your roots torn from the ground." My breath hitched. That leaf had grown on the front lawn of the house I'd bled for, where Grandpa had taught me to read and recite the Pledge of Allegiance under its canopy. It was a threat dripped in nostalgia. My phone chimed. "Mick. Ready when you are. Meet Blackstone Bridge, 11 Tobro p.m. I traced the leaf's edge with a shaking fingertip, feeling the brittle memories of childhood snap under my skin. Something jagged within me settled into focus. This was no longer about property or politics. It was about defending the ground beneath my feet, every splinter of it. I texted Lisa, "Suit up. Tonight we go hunting." Then I stared out the window at the city skyline, wondering if I still had enough courage to face what waited in the dark. By 10:30 p.m., I was parked under the shadow of Blackstone Bridge, my duffel bag in the passenger seat, and my uniform jacket folded neatly beside it. Street lamps flickered, sending intermittent halos through the mist. Lisa slid into the driver's seat of her Toyota laptop, in lap eyes, bright with both excitement and dread. Mick idled up on his motorcycle engine's low rumble like a war drum. We checked our gear lockpicks, borrowed from a retired locksmith, encrypted thumb drives, and a handheld scanner to override simple alarms. My pulse drummed so loud I could almost hear it through my boots. The bridge's steel trusses arched above us like a cathedral of rusted iron, a symbol of the city's industrial might. And its decay, just like Redwood Holdings, once a pillar of growth, now a hollow shell of greed. We nodded at each other, loaded our kits into backpacks, and slipped beneath the bridge's underbelly. Every echo of our footsteps felt like a challenge issued to fate. I would not be silenced by family or corporate power, no matter the risk that lurked in steel and shadow. Redwood's headquarters loomed behind chain-link fences, topped with barbed wire windows, dark except for a few security lights blinking like watchful eyes. I used a small mirror to aim my pen pick at the lock on a service door, and within seconds, the mechanism clicked open. I slipped inside, the stale air prickling my skin. The reception desk lay deserted. A single framed corporate mission statement on the wall read, "Integrity is our foundation." I laughed at the irony, but the sound caught in my throat. We moved down a narrow hallway, and our flashlight beams danced across glossy floors that reflected our trepidation. At the end stood the server room's door keypad blinking red. Lisa punched a sequence stolen from a phished network admin account, the pad flashing green. We exchanged a breathless grin. The door swung open to reveal racks of humming servers' cables snaking between blinking lights like veins of data. My fingers itched to reach in to yank drives from their bays, but a cold warning flashed on the main monitor, security override in 180 seconds. My stomach twisted. 2 minutes to copy everything we needed, and failure meant more than just being run out of here. It meant losing the shot at justice we'd fought so hard to win. Inside that cramped server vault, Lisa plugged in our custom drive duplicator while I watched the timer count down in my peripheral vision. Each second felt like a pistol shot. I ran through my mental checklist, find Project Phoenix, extract it, then scour for email chains under Mark Turner and Sarah Hayes. My hands shook when the file directory appeared, dozens of folders named for lobbying efforts, PAC contributions, and shell corporations. I navigated to Project Phoenix, the code name for Redwood's campaign, to redirect veteran tax incentives to corporate donors, and hit copy. The progress bar inched forward only 20% before a sudden beep accessing archived personal emails. Curious Lisa clicked it. A file open prompt, E. Hayes Personal. I hesitated, but then clicked. A folder of private correspondence wove between me and our mother from years ago, letters I never sent, and pictures of my father on Grandpa's porch. My throat tightened as old regrets surfaced. Never sending those thank you notes from Afghanistan, never inviting him to my commissioning ceremony. If these files fell into the wrong hands, they could be twisted into propaganda. Unstable soldier with daddy issues. I had less than a minute to decide, keep it to help expose a family rift, or delete it to protect my father's privacy. The timer's beep came again. I hit preserve on the personal folder, watching dual transfer bars climb toward completion, Project Phoenix and E. Hayes Personal. 20 seconds to spare. Lisa yanked the drive free and stuffed it into her pack. Just then, an alarm pierced the quiet whir of servers, a high-pitched warning that red lights would soon flood the hallway. We locked down the rack, sprayed computer wipes to erase fingerprints, and sprinted toward the exit door. My heart seized when I saw 2 uniformed guards rounding the corner. There was no turning back. I grabbed Lisa's hand and broke into a run as the corridor's emergency lights flickered on. The polished concrete beneath our boots echoed every frantic footstep. Ahead, the service door loomed free air, only a few yards away. My lungs burned, adrenaline surged, and I realized that in this moment, I was not Emily Hayes, the decorated officer or whistleblower. I was simply a desperate daughter, racing to reclaim what blood and paper had tried to steal. We burst through the service door and tumbled into the alley night air, slapping our faces. Lisa yanked me toward an awaiting motorcycle where Mick revved the engine. I vaulted onto the back seat, duffel strapped across my chest, and held on as he roared down the alley. Brakes squealing around the corner. The world blurred headlights, dumpsters, chain-link fences, until we shot onto Broad Street free. My chest heaved, legs trembling, and I realized how close we'd come to being trapped on the wrong side of that door. Behind me, the server room's red alarm continued its silent war. Lisa called Martinez. "We have Phoenix. We have private Hayes files. We need extraction." Martinez replied, "Secure everything and meet at the hearing room. Tomorrow, they learn the truth." I hung up and wiped sweat from my brow, turning to see Lisa's exhausted smile. We'd risked it all for this haul of data proof, not only of corporate fraud, but of my family's betrayal. Yet as Mick guided us through empty streets, a new question pulsed in my mind was, I prepared for what would happen when those private truths met public scrutiny. At dawn's first light, I returned to Diane Martinez's office, clutching a manila envelope containing the drive we'd risked our freedom to obtain. The corridors felt quieter now, but I sensed the tension in the air like a courtroom before opening statements. Martinez greeted me with weary relief. We laid out the evidence, Project Phoenix files, the emails under my name, revealing family complicity, and a video we'd extracted that recorded Mark Turner ordering the redirection of veteran tax credits. She watched the playback in silence, her jaw tightening. "This is beyond anything we expected," she said, voice firm. "With this, we can move the hearing up to 5 days from now and subpoena every Redwood executive." My heart pounded. Public exposure of family secrets meant my father's legacy would shatter and Sarah's name would be dragged through headlines. But the flicker of triumph in Martinez's eyes reminded me why we'd done this justice for veterans' truth over family loyalty. She glanced at me and added quietly, "Are you ready for your deposition?" I drew in a breath, feeling the weight of every moment that had brought me here, from the sycamore leaf at my apartment door to the heart-pounding server heist. I swallowed hard and nodded. "I am," I said, voice calm but resolute. Outside the window, the morning sun broke free of the clouds, and I realized that after tonight's storm, there would be no more hiding in shadows. I woke before dawn, the guilt and adrenaline churning my stomach into knots. As I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my rental apartment uniform, pressed, and medals shining dimly in the soft lamplight, I slid the silver sycamore leaf tie clip onto my collar. Grandpa's last gift, before he died, a reminder that roots matter even when everything else is burning down, and watched myself breathe in and out until the tremor in my hand steadied. The GPS on my phone blinked U.S. Attorney's Office in bold letters. In less than an hour, I'd be under oath, my every word a potential bullet or shield. I drove through empty streets, the city's hush broken only by my tires whispering on asphalt, wondering if I'd ever feel truly safe again. At the marble foyer, I paused to touch the cold stone banister, as though drawing strength from its permanence, and replayed Diane Martinez's warning. "If they question your methods, we risk everything." I nodded and climbed the steps, the echoes of my boots rattling like distant artillery. Inside the conference room, I slid into the witness chair facing rows of legal pads, pens poised like soldiers ready to fire. The defense attorney loomed slick suit-clipped voice as he asked Lieutenant Hayes, "You admit you accessed Redwood's server without authorization?" My pulse rattled my ribcage, but I met his gaze. "I accessed it under subpoena authorization," I said, voice calm but iron-tempered, to expose a crime that threatened every veteran in this city. He smirked and clicked through a slideshow. My personal emails harvested from the E. Hayes personal folder splashed across the screen. Private letters meant only for my eyes. "These were obtained illegally," he asserted. "Evidence obtained illegally is inadmissible." My heart seized. Martinez's face tightened. They were turning my strength, my truth against me, and in that moment, I realized I had gambled not only my career, but the entire case on methods that could be dismissed in an instant, leaving me exposed and alone once more. I stormed out of the courtroom into the corridor desk chairs, scraping behind me like angry rats. Diane intercepted me, her brow furrowed and hair pulled back tight as a drum. She closed the door to her office and leaned against the frame. "They got you on the hack," she said quietly. "If we can't authenticate that server copy through official logs, we lose Phoenix." My chest tightened at the thought of undoing all we'd risked. Lisa crouched in that server room, Mick waiting on his bike, Delgado's USB drive containing the smoking gun emails. I sank into a chair and rubbed my eyes, thinking of the sycamore leaf on my dresser. Brittle proof of threats that had become personal. What if we subpoena Redwood's internal security logs? I asked. They have to have time-stamped records of every intrusion. Diane tapped her pen. Their IT team is complicit. Sarah Hayes sits on their board and Mark Turner signs off on budgets. They'll stonewall claim privilege. Frustration boiled in my veins, my hands curling into fists on the desk. We need a legal avenue, I muttered. Something that ties those logs to the drive we grabbed chain of custody unbroken. She nodded slowly. Okay, we file a motion for preserved evidence under the Digital Accountability Act. But we'll need an affidavit from the chain of custody witness, Delgado, and a judge's order by tomorrow morning. A flicker of hope ignited in my chest, but Diane raised her finger. One more thing. She slid an envelope across the desk. I recognized Lisa's neat handwriting on the outside, "Do not open personal." My breath caught. Inside was a single sycamore leaf, its veins still sharp pressed between two sheets of clean paper. No note. I looked up at Diane. They're sending me reminders, I whispered. Her eyes hardened. We may not just be fighting Redwood, we're fighting family too. The weight of that truth settled between us, a silent promise that the next move would demand everything we had. That evening, I found myself back at the dilapidated porch of my old house, its windows shuttered for sale signs still sagging in the soft rain. I stood under the sycamore tree, its branches bare now, but still reaching toward the dark sky like silent sentinels, wondering if it remembered the sound of my laughter or the scrape of my elbow when I fell from that lowest branch. My heart pounded in my ears as I climbed the sagging steps and slipped inside through the side door Sarah had overlooked. The interior still smelled of damp carpet and mid-century oak, as though time itself hesitated here. I switched on my phone's torch and crept down the hallway, following muffled voices to the study, where Sarah and Mark huddled over blueprints and ledger sheets. I fumbled for the small recorder in my jacket pocket, pressing it to life with a soft click. Sarah's voice dripped contempt as she instructed Mark to double down on the PAC funding and ensure the anti-vet bill stays buried. My jaw clenched so hard I feared I'd break a tooth. I edged closer until the floorboard creaked under my boot. Sarah whirled, eyes blazing. "Emily," she spat. I bolted recorder clutched to my chest, but not before Mark's silver cufflink caught the light proof he was there. Behind me, glass shattered as Sarah hurled a paperweight, sending jagged shards across the doorway. Pain shot through my ankle when I stumbled over debris, but I kept running, vaulting through the back window into the wet grass. I heard her footsteps on the porch behind me, but dared not look back. My ribs slammed against the window frame as I plunged into the night breath, ripping from my lungs, and the recorder's beeping, filling the darkness like frantic Morse code. I sprinted toward my car, parked on the curb, heart hammering with every step. Soon I was barreling down the familiar streets of my youth tires, hissing through puddles as Lisa and Mick trailed behind me. My ankle throbbed, each pulse synchronized with the beating of my heart, but I refused to slow. I collided with the passenger seat recorder and duffel dropping to the floor. Lisa slammed the door and checked the drive inside the recorder, 2 hours of conversation. Names, plans, admissions of intent, uncontestable evidence of conspiracy to disenfranchise veterans. Relief washed over me in a wave as we peeled into the night. But in the rearview mirror, I glimpsed a pair of headlights lurching forward, closing distance fast. My knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "They're following!" I gasped. Mick gunned his bike to cut them off. Lisa stabbed at her phone, tapping 911. The car behind us flickered its high beams, then fell in behind, pulsating like a predator. My chest constricted with fear and fury. Every betrayal coalesced into a single truth: my family had weaponized loyalty as easily as Redwood had weaponized legislation. I floored the accelerator, heart pounding against the seatbelt, and the shadowy taillight flickered closer, still refusing to back down. I realized then that the fight for my home had become a fight for my life, and the next intersection might decide which side of the line I'd end up on. By sunrise, I found myself at the VFW hall on Broad Street, the old neon sign flickering over chipped paint, like an invitation to both solace and upheaval. A small group of veterans men, missing limbs women, with haunted eyes, greeted me with nods and firm handshakes. In their uniforms, medals, and faded caps, I saw the faces of the community Redwood claimed to protect, but had actually sacrificed. I laid the recorder, the original will, and Delgado's USB on the folding table in the main hall and let them glance at the evidence. Whispers of outrage burgeoned into determined nods. They tried to erase us, one Marine veteran said, voice gravelly, but they forgot who taught us to stand up. My chest swelled with pride and grief as more vets gathered bus drivers, factory workers, teachers, all willing to testify to the truth of their own sacrifices. The American flag hanging behind me drooped, but in their eyes, I saw it standing tall again. Diane Martinez joined us, outlining the protests scheduled for tomorrow, outside Redwood's headquarters. A peaceful march signed affidavits, cameras, and microphones aimed at every stoic face in those boardroom windows. It was risky, no permit possible arrests, but as I looked around at these hardened, resilient souls, I felt an unshakable conviction. Our beliefs in service, fairness, and community had collided with corporate greed and family treachery, and now the world would see who we really were. I pressed the sycamore leaf between the pages of the evidence binder, its veins still visible, and announced, "We rise at dawn." Outside, the hall's windows rattled in the wind, as if the old building itself was bracing for the storm we were about to unleash. I woke before dawn, heart pounding, as I checked my phone one last time. Press release at 8:00 March, at 9:00 deposition at noon. I dressed in my uniform blouse and blazer medals, discreet beneath a lapel that still felt heavy with meaning, and tucked Grandpa's silver sycamore leaf tie clip into my pocket. Outside, the air held that damp bite of late summer, a reminder that Virginia's heat would come. I drove to the VFW hall, past shuttered shops, and parked sedans glimmering with morning dew, my reflection wavering in each windshield. At the hall, veterans gathered in clusters, some stooped with age, others exuding restless energy, each face etched by service and sacrifice. We clasped hands in silent solidarity, a motley coalition of riflemen, medics, cooks, and clerks whose stories spanned decades. I studied their eyes, the steam from their breaths, the tremor in their grips, the stubborn set of their jaws. When I stepped to the front with Diane Martinez beside me, a hush fell over the crowd. Behind us, the VFW banner draped the wall like an old flag standing guard. I inhaled that familiar blend of coffee and stale air, swallowed hard, and spoke of justice, truth, and reclaiming what was ours. As I spoke, I felt my trepidation ebb, replaced by the pulsing certainty that this moment, our moment, could tip the scales. When I finished, applause rose like a tide echoing off the rafters. We marched out in a ribbon of uniforms, casual wear, veterans' caps, protest signs reading, "Honor duty, not deceit in families, betrayed, don't stay silent." I led the way down Broad Street, the crowd parting for us strangers lining the sidewalks in early curiosity. But halfway to Redwood's headquarters, I felt a familiar electric charge in the air, security vans, with tinted windows, burly guards in dark suits lining the entrance. My breath caught as I realized this wasn't just a protest. We were walking into a fortress. The corporate facade of Redwood Holdings towered over us, plate glass windows, reflecting our ragtag army, steel columns holding back the sky. We assembled on the plaza banners, fluttering like wounded flags, our ranks swelling with journalists, activists, even a few curious office workers. I could feel the slick sheen of repression, already private security forming a cordon, cameras on tripods recording every step. I felt my pulse quicken. Doubt rising for an instant, was this reckless? Then I remembered why I'd risked everything. My parents' silence, Sarah's betrayal. Veterans denied the benefits they'd earned. I nodded to Diane, who signaled the start. I stepped onto a makeshift platform, cleared my throat, and began recounting the history of Project Phoenix, how the company siphoned tax credits, manipulated legislation, laundered money under my family's name. As I spoke, a ripple of shock ran through the crowd. A few gasped. Others nodded in grim recognition. Behind the speakers, I glimpsed a familiar silhouette, Sarah flanked by Mark Turner, and a cadre of corporate drones, her eyes narrowed like steel. My stomach lurched. She raised a hand in a half-hearted wave, then turned back to whisper in Mark's ear. It was a broadcast acknowledgement of her complicity proof she stood for everything we protested against. I swallowed the lump in my throat and pressed on voice unsteady only at the edges. The security line shifted forward, their leather shoes clicking against the stone. For a heartbeat, I thought the protest might crack, grow tense, erupt in chaos. But then Diane released a microphone to another veteran who told his own story, how Redwood's schemes had stolen his home after his discharge. The crowd surged, voices uniting in a roar. I realized then our strength was not in quiet petitions, but in shared outrage, communal resolve. Yet as the chant swelled, honor their duty, expose the lie, I felt a flicker of apprehension the next moment, could decide if we broke through or were crushed under corporate power. I stepped off the platform and moved toward Sarah, weaving through veterans whose applause pounded in my ears like distant artillery. She watched me approach, lips thinning, and extended her hand, a betrayal so brazen it stung like fire. I hesitated, my palm hovering midair. The crowd parted, sensing the showdown. Sarah said, voice loud enough for the microphones, "Emily, you're making a spectacle. This isn't how families solve disputes." Mark joined her, arms crossed, as if auditioning for a boardroom ad. I met her gaze, looking for the sister I once knew, but saw only the corporate proxy she'd become. My heart trembled with memories of childhood laughter under the sycamore tree, of her shy smile, at my graduation, of letters exchanged late at night, that Emily felt buried under layers of ambition and greed. I swallowed hard. Families do solve disputes by honoring truth. I replied, voice clear, but you chose deceit. The hush that followed felt heavy, like the breath before thunder. Just then a shout rang out. Someone had breached the security line, an activist waving a dossier of internal emails. The guards surged forward, pushing the crowd back. Diane yelled, "Stand your ground," and the veterans formed a protective circle around me. I felt that circle press into me, their solidarity, a shield stronger than any fortress. But before I could respond, the activists behind me raised their signs and chanted, "Redwood lies, Redwood dies." The security guards bristled, crackling tension like static in the air. I realized that any spark could ignite violence, journalists poised cameras, filming nerves fraying. In that charged silence, I wondered if this day of reckoning might fracture into chaos. A sudden gust of wind rattled the banners, scattering pamphlets across the plaza, and carrying a swirl of dust and top-down blues. I squinted as movement caught my eye. A young intern from Redwood's PR office, paler than the rest, slipped out of the crowd and handed me an envelope stamped, "Confidential, board only." I stood frozen as Diane leaned in, eyes widening. Inside, a series of board meeting minutes detailing secret payments to Mark Turner, directives to bury veteran testimonies, and a clause explicitly naming Sarah Hayes as the liaison. Symbols of hypocrisy lay inked in black and white, a betrayal codified in neat corporate language. My breath caught. This was the decisive twist we needed, the proof that family and corporation had merged into one conspiracy. I lifted the envelope high for all to see, my voice echoing across the plaza. "This is the truth," Redwood tried to hide. A roar rose from the veterans and protesters, shaking the glass facade. Sarah's face flickered between anger and fear. Security guards hesitated, glancing at their superiors. In that moment, the dynamic shifted. We'd moved from protest to irrefutable revelation. Yet as I felt hope surge, I heard a distant siren and saw police cars blocking the street, an escalation none of us had anticipated. Riot gear glinted under the rising sun. The line between peaceful demonstration and confrontation thinned in an instant, and I realized we had only seconds to decide whether to stand our ground or retreat. The police moved in formation shields, raised batons at the ready. A captain's voice boomed, "You must disperse immediately or be arrested for unlawful assembly." The veterans bristled heads, turning as if weighing the cost of defiance. I felt their uncertainty like a ripple through my ribs. I raised both arms, palms outward in the universal gesture of peace. "We came to expose truth, not incite violence," I called out. A hush fell over the protesters as they watched the officers' rigid line. In that quiet, I realized how fragile our resolve felt under the threat of force. Social order, law and order, those were the very structures we'd trusted to protect democracy. Yet now they seemed poised to suppress us. I glanced at Diane, whose jaw clenched, and at Lisa, who gripped her phone ready to live stream. Mick had slipped into the crowd, standing close by, with his motorcycle helmet still in hand. The veterans exchanged glances, some defiant, some fearful. I felt the weight of responsibility settle on me to guide them safely without abandoning our mission. "We will not be silenced," I said, voice steady, "but we will respect the law." Then, with a single nod, I led the crowd in a slow, deliberate retreat down the plaza steps, chanting softly, "Truth cannot be caged." The police cleared a path, allowing us through an uneasy truce. But as we passed the headquarters doors, I noticed Sarah watching from the lobby's shadowed glass, her expression inscrutable. I felt a shudder of anticipation. This withdrawal was only temporary, and tomorrow's deposition would be the true battleground. That evening, back at the VFW hall, transformed into an impromptu command center. I sat at a long folding table, strewn with laptops, case files, and empty coffee cups. The glow of laptop screens painted anxious reflections on weary faces. Veterans nursed bandaged knuckles and aching legs. Diane conferred with reporters on live-stream logistics. Lisa compiled footage of the day's events onto secure drives. Mick fixed the chain on his bike while offering updates from the field. I leaned back in my chair, eyes drifting to the cracked ceiling tiles where decades of smoke had stained the plaster. The air smelled of stale coffee and hope. I closed my eyes and felt the day's adrenaline drain away, leaving raw exhaustion and a pulse of reckoning in its wake. My gaze fell on the sycamore leaf taped to the edge of the evidence binder, a symbol of what had been rooted in betrayal, but now thrust into the light. I realized how far I'd come from that first step at Sarah's gate to leading a protest that shook Redwood's cornerstone. Yet tomorrow's hearing loomed like a judge in black robes demanding more than proof. It demanded moral clarity and unwavering courage under oath. A hush fell as Diane approached her face, calm but determined. "The press release is set for 7:00 a.m., she said. "We'll deliver the board minutes, the emails, and your testimony. They'll know we're serious." My chest tightened with anticipation and fear. This was not just the next step, but the tipping point. We had exposed the conspiracy in public, but the court would decide the outcome. I stood and addressed the room. "We've shown the world the truth. Tomorrow, we make them swear to it." Silence rippled through the hall, heavy with resolve. Outside, the night wind rattled the windows, as if echoing our own heartbeat. In that pregnant pause, I felt the full weight of what was to come, and the certainty that even if the world tried to bury our story, it would only grow stronger in the soil of our conviction. As I stepped through the heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse that morning, the familiar hum of fluorescent lights assaulted my senses, mingling with the faint scent of polished oak and worn leather emanating from decades of archived case folders. My polished Oxfords clicked a determined rhythm on the marble floor as I adjusted the line of my blouse, and my fingertips brushed against the gleaming silver sycamore leaf tie clip tucked into my pocket. The one Grandpa had pressed between his journal pages, a silent promise of roots and resilience. Outside, the sky had been raw and rosy, but inside the cavernous hall, time felt suspended in institutional hush, broken only by distant murmurs of court staff arranging stacks of legal pads and the flutter of official seals being stamped. I paused in the corridor where the walls were lined with stern portraits of judges who had authored landmark rulings, their eyes seeming to weigh me in stillness. A clerk offered a nod, her expression sympathetic, as I wound my way past glass-paneled doors into the high-ceilinged gallery where rows of wooden benches looked like pews awaiting confession. The defense attorneys' slick suits, clipped commentary gathered at the front, their heels tapping softly like a warning. My pulse pounded beneath layers of starched fabric, but I steadied myself by imagining that sycamore leaf pressed to my heart, its veins echoing every lesson Grandpa had taught me about honor and truth. I had come here to speak not just for myself, but for every veteran whose sacrifice had been traded for corporate greed. My fingers clenched into fists at my sides as I marched toward the witness stand, realizing in that breathless moment that the next words I spoke could reshape everything. The judge's gavel rapped once, twice, resonating like distant thunder, and the courtroom hush that followed felt like a collective inhale before a plunge. My name rang out, Lieutenant Emily Hayes, steady yet charged as I rose from the seat behind the plaintiff's table and moved forward, each footfall echoing on the polished marble floor. The prosecuting attorney's kind nod bolstered my resolve as he slid across a thick folder containing the direct examination script, its pages bristling with legalese and declarations of my honorable service. The defense counsel, polished and precise in his ecru suit, stood and began his cross-examination with a clinical edge. Ms. Hayes, did you not enter Redwood Holdings' secured server room without consent? Did you not obtain files unlawfully, including private correspondence? His words, deliberate and cold, felt like barbs, designed to undo every moment of hard-earned credibility. I felt my pulse quicken as he displayed projected images of my personal emails, missives from my mother. I had never sent photos of Reverend Cole's church dinners I had attended as a child, plucked from the E. Hayes personal directory he'd had delivered to the court. For a moment, I remembered the fear of exposure, the vulnerable hopes I'd protected with password encryption now laid bare. But I squared my shoulders and engaged the evidence head-on. I accessed those servers under the authority of a court-issued subpoena. I began voice clear with express authorization from the U.S. Issuer's Attorney's Office. Every byte of data was preserved under chain-of-custody protocols, time-stamped by Delgado's unsanctioned logs, and corroborated by encrypted emails between my team and federal investigators. As I detailed the procedural safeguards, the notarized affidavit validating Grandpa's original will, Lisa's meticulous hash verification of each file, mixed surveillance logs recording my entry and exit the gallery's stiff posture, softened the jurors' frowns, lifting into attentive curiosity. I watched the defense attorney's smirk fade, replaced by a flicker of doubt, as my words wove fact around his insinuations. When I dropped the final piece, the forensic audit revealing the timeline of Redwood's file sanitization attempts, the courtroom exhaled, the veneer of his argument cracking like fragile glass. In that trembling hush, I felt the weight of social order tip toward justice and the courtroom lean into the truth I was unveiling. Just as the tension began to ebb after my detailed testimony, the prosecuting attorney stood, his gaze firm, and announced an unforeseen development. The defense has notified us they will call Mr. William Hayes, the former trustee and defendant in this matter, as their next witness. A cold hush swept through the mahogany-paneled room like an incoming storm front. My pulse thundered in my throat as I watched my father, once the strong figure of my childhood, stride into the courtroom lobby. He moved with measured grace, suit tailored, but demeanor heavy. The silence around him pressing like the weight of unsaid apologies. I felt a pit open in my stomach. This was no casual family dispute. This was the ultimate collision of blood and betrayal. The defense attorney's voice softened as he swore in my father, Mr. Hayes. As trustee of the Hayes Family Trust, you oversaw the transfer of the Raleigh Road property. Did you not authorize the deed to be conveyed to Redwood Holdings, LLC, under what was labeled Family Asset Consolidation? My father cleared his throat, fingers tightening around the armrest of the witness stand, and nodded. His voice, ripe with the cadence of boardroom presentations, described a litany of economic rationale, estate planning, and the need to diversify family holdings to protect against market volatility. I could almost hear the sterile language of corporate board minutes sipping over the memory of my siblings and I playing under that old sycamore tree. My heart clenched as he portrayed my return from active duty as a practical strain on family finances, excusing the forging of my signature as a regrettable but necessary measure. Then, as the defense pressed him to cast me as a disruptor, an outsider unfit for the stewardship of this estate, the judge tapped his gavel. The prosecutor rose with a calm intensity and requested permission to introduce previously undisclosed video evidence. Moments later, the grainy footage of my grandfather's 2001 will signing ceremony flickered on the courtroom screen. Grandpa, eyes bright and voice unwavering, declaring, "This land goes to my daughter Emily, my soldier, because she will honor its roots." My father's face drained of color, glasses slipping down his nose as his hands shook. The galling twist was that the patriarch's own words, captured in raw, unmediated form, undermined every rationalization my father had just offered. I watched his composure shatter like fragile glass, and in that moment, I understood how fragile the facade of loyalty can be. After that seismic revelation, the courtroom atmosphere shifted from heated debate to stunned silence, as if the very air had thickened with truth. The prosecutor rose with the quiet authority of someone who had wrestled with these materials in the still of night, and he delivered a closing argument that cut through the haze of corporate doublespeak like a bayonet. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have examined the unauthored property deeds, the paper trail of laundered funds, the forged notarizations, and most importantly, you have witnessed the unfiltered testament of a grandfather who paid for this land with sweat and devotion. This is not a mere family quarrel. This is a conspiracy that weaponized family loyalty and corporate privilege against a decorated soldier, against someone who sacrificed blood for this nation. Each syllable landed like a thunderclap, and I felt a collective shudder pass through the courtroom benches. The defense attorney attempted one final maneuver, arguing that the video was recorded without authenticity certification, but the judge sustained the prosecution's objection, affirming the clip as an original document admissible under the evidence code. A ripple of relief coursed through me, but it was tinged with the bitter awareness that the cost of truth often eclipses its rewards. When the jury filed out to deliberate, I remained seated, elbows on my knees, head bowed in a silent ritual of recollection, childhood laughter beneath the sycamore's canopy, the hush of military tents at dawn, the solitude of nights spent piecing together legal strategies. Minutes ticked by like eternities, punctuated only by the rustle of docket pages and distant hallway footsteps. Then the heavy oak doors swung open, and the jury took their seats. The foreperson, a middle-aged teacher, who had served in the Army Reserves, stood with a solemn nod. We find the defendants guilty on all counts of forgery, wire fraud, and conspiracy to deprive veterans of rightful benefits. A muted cheer rose from the gallery's veteran contingent. I felt Diane Martinez's hand squeeze my shoulder. Sarah's eyes widened in silent shock, her bravado crumbling into disbelief. My father bowed his head, tears spilling onto his cheeks. The judge's gavel cracked once more, final as a verdict carved in stone. I packed my dossier and looked around the courtroom, absorbing the gravity of this victory. A victory that ripped apart a once united family, illuminated the corrosive power of unchecked corporate greed, and affirmed the principle that justice, however delayed, can still prevail. As I rose from the witness stand, mind racing with the next steps, appeals, restitution plans, restoring veteran benefits, I realized that this moment was not an ending, but a threshold into a future where truth would demand continued vigilance. With a steady breath and Grandpa's sycamore leaf pressed figuratively against my chest, I stepped forward into the restless world beyond these oak doors. The late afternoon sun streamed through the courthouse's towering windows as I emerged onto the broad marble steps, and I was immediately engulfed by a tempest of cameras, microphones, and shouted questions, a maelstrom that felt as unrelenting as any battleground assault. I halted at the Apex uniform, still impeccable though my heart pounded against the fabric of my blouse, and held up both hands in a protective gesture. "Thank you," I intoned, voice firm enough to carve a channel through the din, but my focus today is on restoring dignity and benefits to veterans, not on sensationalist headlines. The press corps shifted as one redirecting their lenses toward Sarah Hayes, whose expression had drained of color. She stood surrounded by a phalanx of attorneys, Mark Turner beside her, eyes darting with defensiveness, legal pads clutched like shields. Reporters probed her with questions about family betrayal, corporate accountability, and the moral cost of her silence, but she offered only a tight-lipped shrug. My shoulders eased as I prepared to turn toward the reserved space where my car waited, but a tentative voice called out from below, "Emily." I looked down to see my mother standing alone, shoulders hunched, clutching a crumpled tissue to her chest, her gaze heavy with unshed tears. In that moment, the bustle of reporters and flashing lights fell away, leaving only the hollow distance between us that had grown like an unspoken chasm over the years. She swallowed eyes rimmed in red and said, I thought silence was safer. I didn't know how deep the rot was, or how much love you carried home in that uniform. Her confession trembled in the late daylight like a shattered melody. My breath stuttered as memories flooded her gentle coo of reassurance on deployments, her absence at promotion ceremonies, the house that once smelled of her cooking and now lay cold and shuttered. I stepped down the steps toward her, each footfall echoing like a question. When I reached her, I extended my hand with deliberate calm. Showing up today did more than any words could I said quietly, watching her fingers tremble before intertwining with mine. Now we have a chance to rebuild not just for ourselves, but for every veteran who's had their voice stolen. The flicker of hope and pain in her eyes told me forgiveness was not automatic. It would have to be earned. As the reporters' murmurs rose again and the crowd pressed forward, I realized that bridging this breach between mother and daughter would be as challenging as dismantling Redwood's empire, and that this step, fragile and purposeful, was only the beginning of a different kind of battle. After the courthouse drama had ebbed, I returned to the low hum of the VFW hall that same evening, its worn linoleum floor and flickering overhead bulbs, a comforting contrast to the austere grandeur of the federal courthouse. The familiar aroma of stale coffee and veteran camaraderie fluttered around me, evoking memories of the Rising Phoenix Bar midnight strategy sessions and impromptu fundraisers for wounded comrades. A circle of my fellow veterans formed in the center of the hall, their jackets patched with unit insignias, their caps carrying battleground souvenirs. On a long folding table lay the now legendary evidence binders, the hard drives that had captured Redwood's misdeeds, and a quaint galvanized bucket filled with dark potting soil. Next to it, a slender young sapling newly dug and full of potential stood poised between past and future, its petite leaves shimmering with evening dew. Diane Martinez watched from the fringes, her posture relaxed, but her eyes alight with the quiet intensity of someone who had weathered every procedural storm for the sake of this moment. She nodded, and I stepped forward, heart humming with purpose, holding the sapling in calloused hands. Kneeling, I pried loose a chunk of floorboard reserved by the hall's caretaker for special occasions, and dug a small hole into the concrete subfloor, each scoop of earth feeling like a promise in miniature. My gloved fingers pressed the sapling's roots into the soil, and I recalled every phrase of Grandpa's old vow. A tree lives by its roots. At my side, a retired sergeant offered a small spade. Planting Hope Lieutenant, he murmured, voice thick with emotion. Around us, veterans formed a silent chorus of acknowledgement, some bowing their heads, others capturing the ceremony on their phones as though preserving a sacred graffiti moment. I gently patted the soil, securing the sapling, then fastened a laminated copy of the sycamore leaf tie clip to its slender trunk with a navy ribbon, a symbol of legacy sacrifice and the rebirth of truth. The room fell into a reverent silence, interrupted only by the soft hum of fluorescent lights. In that hush, I sensed the shifting social paradox. A nation that venerates service, yet allows veterans to be silenced, now gathered to reassert voices long muted by bureaucratic apathy. As I stood and straightened my back, veterans reached out to clamp me on the shoulder, wordless affirmations of solidarity that said louder than any court transcript. I turned my gaze to the newly planted sapling, its leaf buds quivering like a heartbeat, and felt a quiet certainty the roots we set tonight would anchor not only a tree, but a movement committed to nurturing justice long after this hall's lights dimmed for the last time. Later that night, back in the solitude of my apartment, I hovered over a blank document on my laptop. My op-ed draft number 1, its cursor pulsing like a metronome in an empty room. The city skyline shimmered through the window, a constellation of corporate towers and neon signs that had tried to eclipse the everyday lives they relied upon. I sipped a mug of chamomile tea, its steam curling upward in lazy spirals, as I considered how to distill weeks of court battles, moral reckonings, and family fractures into a coherent argument. The blinking cursor felt as demanding as any drill sergeant justify it. I recalled the faces in the courtroom, gallery veterans in wheelchairs, mothers clasping photographs of fallen sons, taxpayers who had shielded Redwood's ascent. How could I frame their stories without exploiting their grief? How could I illustrate the contradiction of a democratic system, professing equal justice while corporate entities quietly pulled strings in boardrooms? My sycamore tie clip lay on the desk beside me, glinting like a silent reminder of my grandfather's wisdom. I began to type. We witness each day the gulf between promise and practice, the disparity between patriotic rhetoric and legislative reality. When veterans return home, we owe them more than lip service. We owe them transparency, accountability, and conviction. My fingers stumbled over words, erasing phrases as quickly as I wrote them, chasing the precise balance between pathos and pragmatism. Hours slipped away as sentences took shape, weaving legal nuances with social commentary. The corrosive impact of unchecked influence pitted against the integrity of individual sacrifice. When I finished, I saved the file under Truth and Roots Final and stared at the screen as if that final command rooted in truth would take hold of the world. But I sensed that even the most eloquent op-ed was only a single voice in a chorus that demanded sustained action. My heart pressed against my ribs, aware that transforming public outrage into policy change would require more than words. It would demand relentless vigilance and collective will. I shut the laptop, the finality of the click echoing in the dark, and wondered, could one narrative plant seeds broad enough to challenge a forest of entrenched power? The question hovered unanswered as I drifted to sleep. I woke before dawn to the soft chime of my phone, an alert reminding me of the scheduled editorial publication at sunrise. The city outside my window still wore the quiet hush of pre-dawn distant horns and streetlights blinking off as workers trudged toward the metro rail stations. I stretched and found the sycamore leaf tie clip pinned to my pillow, its familiar weight a comforting touchstone of purpose. I reached for yesterday's copy of my op-ed on the nightstand, folding its printed pages into my blazer pocket, before stepping into the shower's solitude, where the steady cascade of warm water washed away both the fatigue and the residue of doubt. By the time I exited in crisp dress pants and a tailored blouse, the first light had crept across the rooftops. I brewed black coffee, the bitterness anchoring me for the day's demands. In my inbox, Diane Martinez had sent confirmation, op-ed accepted. Good work. Also deposition transcript attached. My heart stuttered more hurdles ahead. I settled at my desk just as the email came through, new press inquiries, potential TV interviews, and a request from the Inspector General's office for follow-up testimony on the scheme's systemic implications. Responsibility pressed on me like a second uniform. It seems at once familiar and constricting. A knock sounded at my door. I opened it to find a man in a dark suit I didn't recognize, holding a sealed envelope labeled for Lieutenant Hayes, urgent. His eyes were calm but firm, and he extended the envelope without a word before disappearing into the hallway. I closed the door, my pulse quickening, and took the envelope with trembling fingers. From the hallway came the distant rumble of government vehicles and the soft echo of boots on marble. Inside the crisp paper, I could feel the weight of new secrets waiting to be revealed. I stared at the seal heart, racing with a fusion of dread and anticipation, realizing that justice was not a destination, but a journey of unending vigilance. I turned the envelope over in my hands, unbroken, and wondered what dawn of revelation lay inside this next chapter.